All right, buenos tardes. No, buenos dias. Before the lunch. Wonderful to have you here. I'm very pleased to have you here. Well, you'll call in more people, so then we are coming here. I think now that you're here, I think it's perfect opportunity to see the other side of all this digitalization, of all the research that we are doing, these transformational changes we all want in the agricultural sector for feeding the world. There is also the human side. There's also the human capital that's been used and still being used in the agricultural world. And we heard yesterday one of the solutions, but also some of those old solutions have been the issue of certification, of compliance. 25 years ago, I was here in Almeria, and we started what was then Europe GAP and then became Global GAP. For those that have heard about it, a global certification standard. That was for food safety and good agricultural practices. We added more and more on social, on water, etc. But the compliance of certification, you have a multiple level of different certification. It's getting to the end and to the nerves of many of the farmers and also in the sector. So I think there is now, and they were not able to capture. Now we heard yesterday regenerative agriculture, this continuous improvement. They were not also able, what many people see, to actually bring a level of understanding to engage the workforce, to engage the vulnerable part of the population of the workforce that are used day in, day out, particularly during harvest. And a big part of that is migrant labor. And that is part of a hotspot as well in Andalusia, in particular here also in Almeria. Did you know what is the World Day today on 20th of June? It's the World Refugee Day. More than 30 million of people are refugees. Not all are in Europe. Most of them are within their own country or with their neighbor country. But we have a hotspot. We have more than 130, 150 different nations in this region of Almeria, coming from around the world. Herman said yesterday his family left to London, his parents, because Almeria was nothing. Now with agriculture, it's a hotspot. It's also a hotspot of attraction because there is a lack of labor. There's a need for labor for harvesting. So that's why also many of refugees, of people that come, of migrants, spot here because they are hoping to find also work in agriculture. And that creates issues. Issues on communities, issues on the labor market itself. So now this question is, looking not only at this, human labor is a major force, a major input. Are the companies now doing the right thing in the agribusiness? How can we now address this? The old way of compliance, it's still very valid. Certification comes a bit to an end of what to achieve. Now new legislation is coming. It's called supply chain due diligence legislation. So the due diligence is the new way of doing things. But that is completely different than sending an auditor to a farm or to a factory and make a compliance audit. No, that means collaboration. That's a new form of supply chain integration and collaboration. And I'm so happy to have here now really an NGO, a non-government organization. We've been working for a year together quite nicely already with Ruben, and someone else with Catherine, having someone that is really deep in coming from this area, living in this area, and at the same time consulting the big brands on all the area of human rights, due diligence. So a really distinguished experts in this area, combining the activity we are doing with Appellando, which I will be explaining. So everybody has seen this picture. That's where we are, and that was first when I basically came, 74 was just the year after I was born. No, I'm kidding. Now it was 10 years old to be true, but I wasn't then here. But I was here in the 90s, and it became already with some more plastic. And this is where it's now in 2000, and it's now still getting more. This plastic will become to be recycled. There are immense opportunities now. We heard it yesterday. I couldn't answer, but there are activities from CoExpal, the regional organizations, to have projects now to really build them and recycle them. So there's a lot. But some way of recycling is a form of reuse. And you see this reuse in the social dimension. This one, the left one, is not a real reuse, but if you go into the back, you may see it not quite well, but you see it more in the right picture. That's next to a strawberry field. There are houses, no, tents, chabolas. Those are illegal settlements, irregular settlements of migrant workers. They may not have a work contract yet. They are in the country, but they may get occasional labor and work, but they have not an opportunity to rent a house. They have not a place to do this, and we'll have more about that from Ruben. So this is next to the farm. The farmer suffers in the peak season for having right labor. In Huelva, which is on the Atlantic side of the coast from Spain in the south, next to Portugal, that's the center of the berry production. There are 12,500 Moroccan women every year being in a circular migrant working session. They are hired locally, they come with boats, and they are organized from the governments, the two governments, in a contract to come and work in agriculture. They have already their contract, and that used to be a seasonal agreement. We'll come back to that later, but what that means, they are here, and then they go back to their families and come back the next year. All that, how they work, where they live, these are the issues we're driving. Now, I would like you to give the big overview. What is happening, what are the issues in this whole area of looking at human rights due diligence. After last year, we had 75 years of the General Human Rights Declaration of the United Nations, the Universal Human Rights. That is have we got there? Where are we now? Right? Is it also still on that positive trend? So Catherine, I would like to ask you to have your presentation.
Great. Thanks very much, Kristian, and good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for having me here. It's a real pleasure. My name is Catherine Morgans. I'm a senior consultant at a London headquartered consultancy called Ergon Associates, but fortunately I'm based here in southern Spain. We've been working in the business and human rights space for almost 2 decades now, supporting clients on human rights, labour rights, gender and development issues. And we work with a really broad range of clients, and that's really valuable to us. So that's from kind of multinational corporations, perhaps in the agri-food space, so we work a lot with food retailers, food manufacturers, but we also work with others from, say, chemicals, pharma, electricals, textiles, really broad group. And then on the other side of the business, we also work with international organizations and development finance institutions, so development banks and their investee companies around the world. In terms of geographies, I mean, admittedly, most of our clients are based in Europe and the US, but we work in our projects around the world, so Asia, Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa. And through that, we've developed an awful amount of learnings through our work. And I specifically work a lot with our agri-food clients, so food retailers and manufacturers over in the private sector side of the business, specifically supporting them on what we call human rights due diligence processes. For those of you who aren't familiar with human rights due diligence and what that really means within a company, the graphic here on your right-hand side starts to explain some of that. So it begins with supporting them on the development of policies and their general kind of governance and ambition, and then also supporting them with, say, risk assessments through the business, human rights impact assessments, potentially looking at specific agricultural supply chains or sites and what the risk issues there are for them, as well as then moving on to help them mitigate those impacts, right? So that can be through supporting them with changing their supplier selection and requirements, their policies, getting involved in certain certification standards, and changing their buying practices as well, and really taking like a critical look at how the business is driving those impacts all the way down the supply chain. We also support on grievance mechanisms and the development of those within supply chains, as well as monitoring and ongoing reporting of those kind of KPIs that they develop in relation to human rights. Something we also do across our work is engage with stakeholders. That's really important, obviously. So that could be institutional stakeholders, which represent those peoples affected in agricultural supply chains, but also the rights holders themselves, right? So the workers and the communities in the supply chains that we're looking at. This slide just provides you a bit of overview of some of the clients that we work with in the agri-food space. Hopefully some of them are familiar to you, so particularly kind of food manufacturers and retailers across Europe, also in North America. We work with them a lot on those human rights due diligence elements that I just explained on the previous slide, so risk assessment, impact assessment, policy development for them to start kind of moving forward on their kind of human rights journey and becoming a bit more ambitious. And then on the other side, we have the real pleasure of working with organizations like Rainforest Alliance and Fair Trade. We've been working with Rainforest Alliance for many years now, most recently supporting them in understanding how grievance mechanisms work among their certificate holders and what can be done to improve those kind of complaints mechanisms for workers in their certificate holder farms. Again, there's also some UN agencies on there. We've been supporting the ILO over the 2 decades we've been in existence on a range of technical issues when it comes to labour standards, but particularly in agri supply chains too, most notably sugarcane and coffee quite recently, helping them develop interventions to address child labour in kind of key growing communities in a handful of different coffee producing countries. And then there on the right-hand side, you can just see the type of work we do and the real broad range of agricultural products we work with. So tea, coffee, wine, nuts and seeds, cocoa, and then also, of course, the fresh produce sector as well, which is very relevant to being here in Almeria. So here we just have a bit of an overview of what are the key human rights kind of risks and impacts we often see in agriculture. It's not to say that these exist in all agricultural supply chains. Obviously, there's great variation, but these are definitely the most common that we come across in our work to varying degrees. Again, I'd also like to caveat, it's not specifically talking about Spain here either. But labour informality is a really big one, particularly in more developing contexts, like developing countries, where there's just generally high levels of informality in the labour market anyway. But even in more developed countries, just owing to the need for kind of labour during harvest seasons, you get a lot of informal contracting, given that the work is just for a short period. And that then has kind of collateral impacts in terms of social protections and the rights that those workers have. Moving on, we have working conditions issues, which I think are probably the most common in terms of reports of kind of excessive hours, unpaid overtime, and perhaps wage manipulation. That's particularly an issue in sectors where you have what we call piece rate work, which I'm sure quite a lot of you are familiar with, where the worker is paid perhaps per kilo or per box, and there's not always great systems in terms of transparency in what that worker should be earning. You also have unethical recruitment issues. Owing to the kind of workforce shortages and just the temporary nature of, labour during a harvest season, lots of farmers are increasingly rely on labour intermediaries, which in a lot of countries are not particularly well managed. And that just opens the door to a lot of non-compliances, particularly with some of those working conditions issues I'm mentioning. And in more severe cases, issues surrounding perhaps workers paying for their job, having deductions from their salaries, paying for things like accommodation, transport, which, leading on to the next point relating to forced labour, can create issues and situations which show indicators of forced labour. So perhaps debt cycles that workers cannot work themselves out of because of all of these deductions that they're continually experiencing. You also have occupational health and safety. I think it's a big one and one that a lot of people are more familiar with. We often see issues relating to kind of inadequate personal protective equipment or inadequate training of workers on how to use it properly. Then you've got just obvious issues relating to what is ultimately very hard work, right, in terms of exposure to heat, cold, repetitive strain injury, heavy weights, cuts, and the big one is also pesticide use or improper use of pesticides, which then ultimately can affect the worker's health. Child labour in certain contexts, but particularly more often in smallholder contexts where you have family farms. But that's not to say that it's not a risk issue in larger farms in certain sectors. Discrimination, particularly affecting migrants and women and the types of roles they get offered, perhaps the amount they're paid, and certainly their opportunities for growth, right, to go up to, say, a supervisor level. We see that as a common issue. Gender-based violence and harassment, or GBVH, is a real concern for particularly vulnerable migrant women in agricultural contexts. And unfortunately, we have good reason to believe it goes unreported a lot of the time, mainly owing to their vulnerabilities, the power dynamics of often having male supervisors and like a female workforce perhaps. And there's also just a lack of grievance mechanisms and encouragement for women to speak up about perhaps some of the exploitation that they face. Living conditions, I think, are a really big one because you obviously have that temporary housing in agriculture for harvest workers, which can sometimes be overcrowded, unsanitary, in the worst case situation, perhaps not even having things like running water. So that's a really big one. But I think when we're talking about living conditions, it's also important to think beyond the workforce. So a farm, for example, can have impacts beyond that in terms of the impacts it's having on the living conditions of the community that surrounds it, the resources that they have, either through use of pesticides or water and so forth. And then lastly, access to remedy. So that's the opportunities for workers to kind of speak up about some of the issues that they face. They're often lacking in the agricultural sector. And it's kind of compounded by some of those issues I already mentioned in terms of high levels of informality, perhaps high levels of turnover because you've got a migrant workforce. And then also perhaps even language issues, right, and literacy issues, which stop workers from speaking up about some of the challenges they face. But I will leave it there for now, and hopefully we can talk more about some of that in the questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Catherine. Yeah, just leave it there. Thank you. Ruben, would you want to specify what's here in Spain and what's your experience from the NGO side? Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you to kick off. I'd like to thank IFAMA for organizing its international meeting in a city like Almería, where I was born. And when I was young, I played here the guitar. and this is, of course, this is a place where, without a doubt, agro-industry plays an essential role in the development of the territory itself, but also in the local, regional, European, and international level. As a consequence, in the lives of millions of people around the world. If you let me, Kristian, I'd like to dedicate my first second to you. Thank you, Kristian and Appellando, for having us in mind for this panel and for having into account the added value that a civil society organization such as Cepaim can contribute not only in the defense and promotion of human rights, but also in the business and territorial development itself. Just a couple of ideas on my organization. My name is Ruben Romero. I represent Cepaim, Fundación Cepaim. Cepaim Foundation is an organization located based in Spain, in more than 39 territories of the Spanish geography and more than 10 regions. Additionally, we are in a permanent, we have a permanent delegation in countries such as Senegal, Morocco, and recently we have just opened a new line of cooperation with other Latin countries such as Ecuador. We are an organization with more than 1,400 employees and a solid work of more than 30 years in the defense and promotion of human rights. In other words, Cepaim is an independent and sustainable organization that gives response to social dynamics related to migration and social inclusion processes from a communitarian-based approach in base of these 4 principal pillars that you can see in the screen. To start with my intervention on the subject of the panel, and in order to be able to give you an adequate response, I'm going to let myself the freedom, the liberty, Kristian, to modify the title of the panel, and instead of talking about our food producer doing the right thing, I'm going to ask you all, can a structural situation like the agricultural sector in Spain be addressed only by producers? As Kristian mentioned earlier, as we have seen also in the slides, the reality of the agribusiness sector is a structural reality, a reality that necessarily has to have a multi-stakeholders and multi-level approach, and indeed, producer and all the different actors involved in the supply chain have a fundamental role to be played. In order to give you some complementary data in relation to the impact of the agriculture on the lives of migrants and refugees in Spain, we can look at the first graph. As you can see, according to the data from the Ministry of Migration, Inclusion and Social Security in February 2024, around 232,000 migrant workers in our country were engaged in the agricultural sector, which represent 25% of the total number of workers in the sector. Just in the last decade, the number of migrant workers in our country has increased by more than 1 million people. In other words, 1 out of every 4 workers in agribusiness is a migrant. The basic needs, the food that we produce and that we consume, come because and thanks to the value that these people also produce, not only economically, but also socially speaking. You can imagine the impact that this situation can have in our society. And I ask myself again, can a structural situation be solved only by producers? Can a problem like the settlement in Huelva or in Almería be solved only by producers? Can there be good working conditions without the necessary social dialogue? Can there be a legal framework for recruitment, diversity management, interculturalism, and coexistence without the political will of our decision makers? Can there be recognition of the others without the necessary intercultural dialogue in the supply chain? Can we move forward in building stronger, more resilient and diverse societies without the collaboration of the different stakeholders present in the territory, in Almería, for example? The answer is actually clear. We need producers, workers, companies, stakeholders present in the territory, such as academia, the universities, trade unions, NGOs, and obviously the decision makers, the politicians, to generate trust, value, and a productive agri-food system that respects labor rights, the environment, and consequently, human rights. And I insist, human rights and due diligence is the key. And it's the key because it's the best measure of trust and strength for a sector that is actually essential for our lives. We need, as a society, to consume with more trust, and we need, as an agribusiness sector, to move towards a new model of production, consumption, and management based on rights. We have obligation as a society that the United Nations guiding principle themselves provide to us. In recent years, the human rights agenda has included issues that companies need to pay special attention, such as the climate change and its implication for human rights, the problem of the forced labor around the world, and the impact of artificial intelligence on people, amongst others. The relationship between the environment and the human rights has become increasingly evident in recent years, and the United Nations General Assembly actually declared 2 years ago, in 2022, that everyone in the world has the right to a healthy environment as a human right itself. Business, I mentioned before, play a central role in the fight against climate change and the responsibility to reduce climate change impact. And enforced labor, or as we know, the modern slavery, is still a reality. Today, around 50 million people around the world are trapped in this situation in an attempt to overcome poverty, food insecurity, improve their lives, and provide for their families. And contrary to what you can imagine, this is also a phenomenon present and happening in the developed countries. According to the figures that the Ministry of Interior published, there were 89 recognized victims or labor exploitation in 2022 in Spain. And unfortunately, the agricultural sector is the sector that contributes the most to these statistics, and the most of the victims of these practices are vulnerable people such as migrants, refugees, or stateless. Nonetheless, and also to be positive, we have a more and more serious, safer, and reliable regulatory environment, both for the supply chain and also for the consumers. And we really welcome the German law on corporate due diligence in the supply chain, which is really a pioneer in the area at the European level. We welcome the EU Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, and we also welcome the recent Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive approved 1 month ago. The challenge that we have experienced as a result of the implementation of this regulation is crucial. We have to move from recommendations to obligation. But the challenge that now keep ahead of us is even bigger. We have to move from obligation to awareness, and therefore to change. Because change is how we experience the employment relationship. Because change is how we experience our food management. Change is our narrative on migration and the agri-food sector, and change is how we believe that, yes, that you, as producer, are doing things right. Consequently, due diligence is an ongoing process that all the companies must undertake to identify, prevent, mitigate, and account for how they prevent and address their adverse human rights impacts on people in their value chain. And furthermore, in this process of political commitment and company commitment, we must know how to identify our purpose as a company, what impact we want to generate in the territory, and what are our strategic alliances for this purpose. And in this map of alliances, all the different stakeholders must be essential to generate alliances, to generate impact, and to achieve our purpose. Because it's time to move from the problem to the action, to the opportunity. Because now, more than ever, it's time to commit that using traceability system or grievance mechanisms such as Appellando or the ethical trade forums to generate traceability in the supply chain process. This is also an opportunity because it's time to generate tools such as traceability audits or social audits as tool for the implementation of trust in the producer and also in the consumer, because now it's time to move from problem to action. And also because, moreover, there are several success stories, because there are stories such as those of Brahim, Ibrahima, Mamadou, Sekou, Fofana, or my colleague Francisco, where through the collaborative work between the Ministry of Migration, Inclusion and Social Security, Fundación, Cepaim, and our legal and employment counseling services, companies in the territory of Níjar, such as Coproníjar, and the refugees and migrants community, we have managed to enable them to regularize their status, obtain employment training, be employed, and consequently contribute to the construction of a present and a future society, a society that is aware of the value of diversity, of human rights, and of the value that these elements bring to the economy, the social, the business development of the country. And because more than anything else, today in the International Refugee Days, we are all human beings. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ruben, for this. Yeah, we've seen the move to action, and we see the people here in the element of the human capital. Now agriculture, we've been speaking about, we've got to address climate change. We have a big impact. We've got to look at biodiversity, a big challenge. Regardless, we still have to feed the world. That's part of that theme as well with innovation and sustainability. And then it's the social component, and it's the social dimension, and it's about the dimension of dignity of the human rights of all the people around us. And that was one of those elements after 20 years of working in certification, starting Global Gap, working with Global Gap as certification. It was food safety initially, it was crop protection product controls, it was traceability, but it was also a biodiversity environment, as well as with a global risk assessment on social practices. There was also some assessments for the social audit and situation. And this all still, even though I was a bit critical in the beginning, this all stands. This whole system of certification does require a structured way, and whoever farm was using this, they have in fact the first years really been benefited from it, to have a structure, to have good training. We saw that with the small farmers, that when you know how to do and operate, it's very important to have that structure. And we've got long-term relationships with Global Gap and Bayer, with the Baker program that was already embedding this into a very good process. And now that was when these retailers saw now there's new legislation. There is and you don't have to read all of it, it's only the one piece, the establishment of a complaint procedure. There's a new German legislation started in 2023 where companies with 3,000 and more employees in Germany had to demonstrate that they will have to take out a strategy to take out human rights violations out of their entire supply chain, not only their own company, as well as some major United Nations environmental components. The idea is it's the only core labor issues. It's all the things, nothing, no German specific law or EU law. These are United Nations agreed labor requirements. But the governments weren't able to look at internally. So they said, well, if you build wealth of food production and then a profitability, like society thinking of that, you build it on the base of the most vulnerable people. You have elements of modern slavery in the supply chain. We've got to take some responsibility, because there is a responsibility of the big buying companies in that way. They tried it voluntarily for many years. Also the Merkel government tried it voluntarily, but they saw it's not going to come. So regulation had to come. And that was the blueprint for the European Supply Chain Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. It's a new directive that will come into force, that will just been passed in 2 years' time. Companies will nationally implement that. So that what is in Germany, and I'm explaining now, will be effective, very similar to many European companies now in their supply chains. And part of that is to build a grievance mechanism, a helpline, to make it visible. Basically, this is the simplified supply chain in agriculture, right? You have, I'm talking about the strawberry producer or the tomato producer here in under plastic or open field in Almeria, they will always have more than one retail customer. That's very seasonable. Now, if these retailers now on the right-hand side are required to have a grievance mechanism, a helpline, what they have done, the first ones have done is they sent out a poster with a QR code and a website, multiple languages, for workers, and this is 25% migrant workers, in the region on a farm. If I am not getting cannot get my salary, if I have to get unpaid overtime or whatever is there, and my farmer isn't responding to me, my employer, I have the right and should easily have access to call Aldi, Lidl, Rewe, Edeka directly as a customer in Germany. I have this problem and you are buying these tomatoes. Well, how would that worker know? Where does the tomato go to, right? So the problem will be, if you look at those, there will be a wall, not anymore Global Gap plus some certificates. There will be like 10, 3, in this case 3, or in this case 2 different phone numbers, even 10 to call. What's one thing in common with all these helplines? Basically 0 calls. This is a nice thing to have, it's window dressing. So that's why there need to be effectiveness criteria. We can talk about that, what is effectiveness in these grievance calls and mechanisms. So these retailers supporting certifications that will need help because it's fully inefficient and not working and not effective if everyone puts out a helpline. So that was one of my major decisions. We've got to have someone that has the knowledge at least to drive this new thing and help these workers. So I stepped aside, let the others continue with Global Gap in the management, and I said, we'll start new. Appellando Limited is a sister organization of the Global Gap, but we're independent from any standard. So we're now starting with a service with these retailers to start. We were able in half a year to bring them on board, and now this is like more and more organizations that joined up, and it's free to join online, to be a supporter, to drive this. It is a working group. These are already Latin America starts to sneak in because we see 5s here that we are also going further. But we say we start in Spain, largely because pretty much my own experience, and also the big volume of produce going to Germany from here. And we start in Spain and try the entire country. Can we establish a single 911 helpline for all workers that would then go there, get access to remedy, which was the last point which you were saying, and we will find a way to actually build a staged process. The staged process is we all want that there is a social dialogue. Like you, whoever is employed, you want with your university, etc., you want to have a good relationship with your employer. And you do that. Isn't that what we also want for every worker also on the farm? So how can we establish that? How can we bring that in? That is a bit of danger because you build maybe a history of a different farm worker. I grew up on a farm. Some people start with children to work there. It is difficult. But then the next level we would put in is we want these farms to have an external helpline to help them mediate. Someone knowledgeable. And in the next level, we would even bring consultancy of NGOs into it. What's a good solution in this space? So we get the social dialogue with NGOs. Cepaim is involved there very much from the very beginning, other NGOs, consultancies. And then the next one, if you cannot resolve this locally, and that's what we all want, because we don't want to have millions of calls of, oh, my gloves don't fit or something in the harvesting. We want really serial issues that are not being resolved. Then we engage the customers, and that means we need a new way of transparency and traceability, of collaboration. This isn't a certificate. And the beauty of the new law is that the law requires, if you have a complaint and you know about the complaint, you have to go and dig into it as a retailer. But it's not hit and run, like you lose the certificate, I don't buy from you anymore. And in food safety aspects, that's a very good decision to do. But no, you have to stay and engage. That you need to prove to the German government, who checks the retailers, yes, I've done my due diligence to make sure I have an arrangement so that the workers that made a complaint actually benefit from it, because if I pull out, there's no benefit. So that's a new form of supply chain transparency and collaboration where we go to. Maybe I forgot, the last one is, this is so much systemic. Regulation is there, now awareness is there. We need to work on that whole range of working together in a collaborative way. So we're establishing also a national roundtable. We partner with organizations. The idea is not a new certification, but similar, we want local organizations that operate a helpline. Most likely it's also multi-stakeholder groups. They locally are looking for the resolution with the local law, with the local culture, with the local people and languages. And only we are like an overflow mechanism. If it doesn't work, you can go to the customer. So you get the filtered one of the non-resolved issues. That's the concept of Appellando. We start in Spain. Next year we start in Italy. Then we move forward. But it will not stop in the fresh produce. We will go to all food. That's the ambition. We even go to beyond food, processed food. But then also we've requests from textile, with requests even from do-it-yourself. So it's the same concept. Even agrochemical companies where they buy a lot of other things, or universities that are sourcing also from whatever, it's food, etc., would be falling under this law. Now, I don't want to go too much into this detail. What are we doing? You can see this and take a picture or take the presentation later. What is this? I rather want to have the discussion now with us. Or is it? Yeah. So the question and answers in a way that to get you involved. Usually when most attendants, when I was at a IFAMA event, and that's more than like 20 years, I think, I like to walk through the aisles, okay, to pick up the questions. So, so be prepared. I might just put this microphone to your mouth if you have a question, your experience. But before that, I would like to give the floor again and a question to you. So is there any sort of business case, Catherine, for a company to get engaged and get involved? I mean, we had the same thing. We're talking to producers here in Spain. Is it another certification? If you ask us and require us to do it, we're going to do it. But is that really worthwhile? Yeah, yes, it should be. They just, if it's on, then they start. Take that one on.
Thank you, Kristian. In terms of the business case, well, I think you've touched on it a little bit already, right, with the emerging regulation for getting involved. I mean, obviously there's more than that and more than simply just doing the right thing, but it's undeniable that that's what's pushing a lot of companies at the moment, particularly in Europe because of the EU CSDDD, the German legislation, and it's been a kind of continual travel really in that direction from, you know, since the UK Modern Slavery Act. We've been going from reporting to now actually kind of basically obliging companies to, requiring companies to have those kind of full human rights due diligence systems in place. There's also the reputational element, which is still really important, although I like to think that businesses have moved on a bit from just fearing kind of headlines, but I think that's still a really big part of it. You also have the fact that, you know, human rights risks are really integral to risk management within a company. So many companies have been doing risk management forever, but not really looking at human rights risks in the same way and the threats that it poses to its business. And I also think that, particularly with agricultural supply chains, but it does apply across all sectors, there's this increasing importance to basically create a resilient supply chain, right, and maintain like a license to operate. And I think that is particularly important in agri just because of the challenges it faces in terms of climate change, global competition, increasing challenges relating to kind of workforce shortages in certain contexts. We see our clients increasingly putting more and more value on those supply chain relationships they have, concentrating their supplier base, and working more with kind of those specific suppliers. And that involves a partnership. It involves improving human rights performance, creating kind of a better relationship the whole way down the supply chain with your suppliers, with the workforce, which is there as well. And I think human rights due diligence and improving your human rights performance is central to that in terms of, safeguarding your business in the future.
Well, thank you, Catherine. Is that an easy, just second question, is that an easy go, or are you more called to resolve a problem, or is it a bit of a hard sell sometimes?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Is it sometimes a hard sell, or are you always called to help?
I think fortunately with our clients, it isn't so much of a hard sell, right? They tend to come to us because they want to be leaders in the sense that, as I mentioned earlier, I like to think that we are now at a place in business and human rights where companies are going beyond just what they're obliged to do, but there's more of a race to the top, right? And they're looking at their competitors. Lots of them come to us referencing, oh, well, so-and-so is doing this, we can't be seen to not be doing the same. So I think it's becoming an increasingly easy sell, and that's a great place to be.
Okay, well, thank you. Now, you also mentioned, Ruben, you mentioned this one example there where you helped to get the right papers for workers. And so you have some good examples of companies. You work with companies as well, right? So there is this fine line of NGOs, some of them designed to go against companies, some see there's a benefit to work together, and you do work quite well together. So what are the good examples of those collaborations?
Well, as I mentioned before, one of our principal pillars of action is to create a collaborative environment between the companies, the NGOs, the migrant workers, and so on. And as a result, in the last year, for example, as Cepaim, we have been working with more than 1,000 companies. And just in the last 7 years, we have been working with the companies by creating diversity and equality programs in their own companies. I think for a company to work with an NGO is always like an element of trust. I mean, when a company can demonstrate the impact in the territory in alliance with an NGO and in alliance with young workers, it's always an added value, and it's always success, you know. In relation to the regularization of migrants, we work in different parties. The first, for us, our principal pillar is to work with the migrants as a counseling, as lawyer. We work also with the company in awareness raising activities, and also by facilitating the regularization of the young migrants. Just in Spain, around 500,000 workers are undocumented, which is a huge figures. And the third pillar is to work with the authorities. In this case, with the Foreign Affairs Office in Almeria and in all the other 39 territories where we are based. So for me, the success is to be able to create an atmosphere of collaboration, because all together can really transform the society. As NGO, we alone, we won't be able to transform the society and to work on the society that we want. So it's obviously it's necessary to work with the companies. And for example, a couple of ideas. In the last 7 years, we have been working with a program on diversity, on a program on equality in the companies, and we have been working with more than 400 companies in Spain. And thanks to this experience, we have created a club of companies, which is called Club Creas. Club Creas is like a collaborative platform with different companies in Spain, but also with other NGOs and other stakeholders. And thanks to this collaborative platform, this Club Creas, we will develop in October of this year our first international congress on human rights and business. So this is my first news for you, Kristian.
Well, thank you. And it's great to see this collaboration effect now within the building trust. In the last year, we've been working on almost 160 hours of online meetings, Spanish, English, to work with the different groups together. Here now it's your chance. Is anyone that would like to have a question? Yes, and I like to move a little bit, so that's the way to do it here, and we can run and have my exercise this morning. Quickly state your name.
Nick Lees from Lincoln University in New Zealand. I have a question for you and a question for Ruben, if that's okay to have two questions. So my question is about the helpline system, and I imagine that if I was a migrant worker, I was undocumented, I had a problem culturally that I would not challenge authority. Culturally, I would not want to be singled out. I might be fear that I might lose my job. How do you see that you can overcome those barriers? Because my feeling would be it would be a very low percentage of undocumented migrant workers who would be prepared to or could have the capability to access a helpline.
Okay. Yeah, well, thank you. I think that's a very, very valid question, but you start with the hardest part, right? The undocumented. So they are not maybe even legally in the country. So that's a very difficult part. One part I can say already, it is working closely with NGOs. It's making very much aware from the producer side that this is there and the help is there. But also we're trying to team up. There are new initiatives like Just Good Work is an app. They start already in the countries before they leave. So they make already what's a good work. They're already training on if you want to go to these countries, what's the right? What's the human right in your language? What is a good work? And what are companies to look for? So let's really just start early. For example, also there's an observatory with NGOs with the Moroccan women. They will do the training already in Morocco in this off-season, so that they know already. I mean, they're documented, right? But it is a slow process on the trust, but it is a constant one. Do you want to add something, maybe Ruben? Or?
Yes, a couple of ideas regarding the cultural barrier or the cultural barrier that sometimes comes in the relation with migrants and companies and NGOs and so on. That's why I think that interculturality is really the answer. If not only the companies or the NGOs or the civil society, but also the government put in the center of the politics the interculturality, maybe this intercultural approach and intercultural dialogue will be more rich. And this for us is the answer. And regarding the situation with undocumented migrants, this is actually a challenge. I mean, in Spain, as I mentioned before, 500,000 of workers are really working in Spain with no paper. But, according to the Spanish law, at least they are forced to stay in Spain at least 3 years in a non-regular situation, which is in a way the migrants are forced to stay and to work. I mean, their food is not there. They have to work, they have to have their own money, and this relation is really tricky, because at the end of the day, they are actually working. So that's why now in Spain, just to give you one input, in Spain we are under a reform of the national legal framework on migration. And for example, as Cepaim and as alliance with other international organizations, international NGOs, we want to modify the legal framework, because if we have a legal framework that facilitates the regularization of migrants, we all win. I mean, the companies, the young migrants, and also the community, because in a way they will be contributing to the society. So I know this is a problem, but also an opportunity.
Yeah, it is something like 3 years without income. They want to work. Some of them were 10 days on a boat to the Canary Islands. They came here. They get some card. They can go to a hospital, but they are not allowed to work for 3 years. And if you hide away for 3 years, then you can get a work permit if you get a 12-month contract. So who in agriculture provides that, particularly in harvesting? So, but the need is there. The people need the people to work. The thing is, the farmers want them to work. So there is this, and the villages are getting more fuller of people, and so there's also a social dimension to it. One last question. Raj, you have always your special question.
Since you called out my name, that saves time. I don't have to tell you I'm Raj. I think in a discussion like this, we do need to ask the tough questions. And I'm trying to understand from an NGO perspective, is it, do you look at a standardized approach to every issue that is labeled there in agribusiness, or is nuance to the context of what the country has to? And let me try explaining that with an example, because plantation industries in, let's say, domestic in India, tea, for instance, by regulation, plantation owners are supposed to provide them with fuel, with housing, with electricity, with medical support. And you may have husband and wife both working on the plantation. Now that they get this basic input, they don't feel the need to go on the plantation and work every day. Whether they work or don't work, the plantation owners have to provide them with those inputs. The only way you can get the plantation working is to get temporary laborers. You don't want to add on to more problem like that, where you say, okay, let me take on more labor and do more of this. So to understand the context of what the issues are on, just the whole thing about uncontracted laborers, there is a real life context to it.
The standardized approach to it, you have it in different ways. You can use that and bring it into your final comment and answer if you want to for the session.
No, I think that's a great question and a really valid point, to be honest. I personally haven't done that much work on tea, but my colleagues have, and I'm familiar with some of the points you're raising. And I think, I also saw that actually last year with a similar situation in South African wine farms, where you have families which are almost they have the legal right to remain there, and that can cause a lot of social issues on the farm in terms of domestic abuse, drug abuse, and then farmers have difficulties then removing those workers. So there's so many contextual challenges in different supply chains. Also, those rights that I put up there, they'll vary a lot on the context. You see significant differences between larger farms, smallholder farms, and then obviously the national context, as you rightly highlight. I think it can be difficult to get that granular in what we would call like a larger risk assessment for a company, but something that we do a lot of, and specifically myself, are human rights impact assessments looking at specific supply chains, and that's what really gives us the opportunity to go a lot more granular, looking at the country context, the legal framework, the challenges not only facing the workers but also facing the farmers, the suppliers, because it isn't one-sided. Smallholders face a lot of challenges, large farms face a lot of challenges too, so it's important to also take into account those perspectives and delve a bit deeper. And that's hopefully what we do with those impact assessments. Unfortunately, that is more time consuming, right? And it requires more investment on the part of companies. They're increasingly doing it, but it's a slow process. But thank you for your question.
Thank you. You have a brief thing to add. Otherwise, thank you so much. I think you got a grasp of it in this session, that there is a new approach needed. And I think the message and the take home for everyone, for us for the businesses, get engaged with the civil society, get engaged with NGOs locally, with your local contextual way. Make sure that you're getting a new way of working together in the supply chain for research and education. What's the impact? What's the positive impact? What's the value gained with these social dialogues, this involvement? We all know of the labor opportunities, happy worker, happy products. I mean, you've got those things, but I think that's also an educational resource. We need to leave out a bit of our bubble IFAMA is there because we brought the public sector, the industry, academia, and young and old into one room. We've got to even go further outside of it. It's also Ray Goldberg would always say, yes, even more civil society, we've got more disciplines to really resolve this, and we've seen this. So bring that in, expose it much more. I think that's the to-do and the homework for all of us. I thank you very much for being in this session today, and enjoy your lunch. And thank you for my panelists.